Hey, friends, this is an episode of the Church Planting Podcast that you do not want to miss. My friend Greg Lee is joining us. Greg has served Suncrest Christian Church in suburban Chicago, Northwest Indiana, for 25 years. Their fundamental vision of the church is to impact 1 million people by 2034 by starting and multiplying new churches. We're going to learn a ton together with Greg Lee. Well, I'm really excited to have my friend and Stadia partner, church planting extraordinaire Greg Lee on the Church Planting Podcast on this episode. Greg, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Greg. Awesome to be here. Love church planting, of course.
Yeah. Hey, so you've been at the same church in Indiana for 25 years. You're the senior visionary leader now. Is that the role you've always been in? Talk a little bit about that 25 years.
Yeah, so Suncrest is almost 28 years old. Founding pastor was John Wassam, who, of course, has lots of connections with Stadia in the church planting world. And the truth is, I worked under John for 7 years, and then have been the lead pastor for about 18 years or so. And this has been, kind of the journey of my life. I thought, I'm not sure whether I'm going to work under John and then leave to plant the church, or if I'm going to work under John and then stay here so that Suncrest can be the church planting church it needs to be. And it's turned out this way in some pretty wonderful ways.
Okay, so for those of us who know John Wassam, John is, he's been involved in church planting forever. He's a church planter, and he's actually finishing up. He's retiring, I believe, at the end of this year from Stadia, but he's such an essential part of the church planting world. Talk about that DNA he kind of instilled in Suncrest. And then how you've just kind of taken that and blown it up and expanded it.
Yeah. That is the story, right? So when I graduated from undergrad and came to Suncrest, I was 21 years old. And I literally thought, I need to work under someone. And if you know John, he was the perfect choice to work under. And he did. He mentored me and he mentored our church from those earliest stages to say, hey, we're a church plant. We've benefited from others investing in us. We're going to turn that right around and be a church planting church. So the DNA was embedded at Suncrest from John. And like you say, anytime there's a leadership transition, of course, there's some things I thought, I'm going to do this differently. We're going to lead in a new direction. But the church planting DNA, it was just like, that is who we are. That's who I have become. And so just start with that.
Okay. So the latest statistics that have come out are that somewhere between 8 and 10% of churches in the United States right now are involved in any type of church multiplication. And unfortunately, only about 2% of churches in the United States are directly involved in church planting, where they're sending someone or, intentionally raising leaders up to send out. That is not the case at Suncrest. You guys are kind of the poster child of what, healthy church multiplication looks like. Talk a little bit about what's going on at Suncrest with that right now, and then we're going to talk about your vision for the future.
Okay. Yeah. So, it's hard not to talk about the vision for where we are right now, but Suncrest, just has this desire that, whatever we're trying to do in a single person, a disciple, that's what we should be doing church-wide, right? So, discipleship, growth, multiplication is absolutely at the core of that. We want, every person here to have a transformational experience, become an outward-oriented person who reaches more people. And we think that's what a church should be. So it's just almost instinctive for us that at a leadership level, we're raising up people having in mind that, you could be sent out to start a new church. Of course, you could be, become a leader here locally, but it's all a kingdom investment, not just a local church investment.
Okay, I've got to come back to that statement. So church multiplication simply reflects what you're teaching individual discipleship. Speak a little bit more to that. What do you see as the benefit there with, how does church multiplication benefit the discipleship mindset?
I think sometimes churches get inconsistent between what they're doing with individuals, maybe what they're doing with leaders, and what they're doing with church planting. And when you stay consistent, then it just makes sense to everyone. Right. So, what are some of the values around raising up a disciple? We're trying to help people trust God. That's the first decision, to trust God with your faith. and then keep trusting God. Well, when it comes to leadership, then, there's always that sense of like, oh, I just have a group of people I'm leading. You're like, no, we're leading somewhere that we couldn't do on our own. We're going to trust God. What's a church doing as a whole? Well, we're going to create a vision that trusts God, that isn't something we can just calculate for ourselves. So, that's one principle. Take another one, contributing by serving. Like Jesus didn't come, to be served, but serve and give his life as a ransom. Well, that's an individual disciple. That's what our leaders ought to do. And collectively as a church, of course, it's easier when it's almost that when we were young and poor and small, you could risk anything. You're like, well, if it doesn't work out, we didn't lose much. You get a little larger, you get a little more resources, and I feel people tending to pull back from the risk, right? Or even pull back from saying, we're going for it. We're serving, that we're outward, we're not protecting ourselves. And so all of those things that we're trying to develop in a single person, we just think that works all the way through the system.
So when you're young, you're struggling financially just to make it as a church plant, and everybody relates to that's planted. But it doesn't really get any easier, right, Greg? Then you grow to 400 or 800 or even much larger. And now you have more debt, you have more staff that you're responsible for. But talk about the generosity factor and how that's played out at Suncrest.
When Suncrest began, John Wassam, put this vision in that from the very beginning, 10% of all of our offerings were going to go to church planting. That was just the DNA from the beginning. And one of the ways I tell the story is, it took us 7 years before we were able to be a serious partner in our first church plant, right? In the next 7 years, we were able to be a serious partner in 7 church plants. Last year, in 1 year, we were able to be a serious partner in 7 church plants. It just scales for us. But it would have, you don't get to here without those first 7 years saying, this is what we're going to do. One of the visions John cast was to say, we were meeting in a high school. We did that for 7 years ourselves. In some ways, we were just conserving resources so we could be generous to others. But John cast this vision to say, before we ever move into our own building, we will be a major partner in starting a new church.
Wow.
And so, I benefit from that because, it was embedded. I didn't have to change the mindset of our church. I just built on something else. But I tell people all the time, you can't think, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, when we have more, then we'll be involved. You won't.
Okay. So we talked about John's vision, but man, when I read your vision, I was pretty blown away. And of course we've discussed it personally and stuff, but talk about the vision now. I think that you have a vision for 2034, the year, and give us an update.
Yeah. Let me tell you the story a little bit. So the vision is that Suncrest would impact 1 million people by the year 2034 by starting and multiplying new churches. That's the vision. That is the primary vision of our church. So, if you're an average attender at Suncrest, you know our mission and you know that vision. And let me give you where that came from. Obviously, all the DNA had been placed in us from John. I was really fortunate early on in my leadership years here to hang around New Thing Network, Dave Ferguson, those guys a lot.
Fantastic.
And I was in a meeting, just a small meeting with Dave years ago, and he was casting this vision to impact 1 billion people, right? And I sat there and I thought, that's too big for me, honestly. But I thought, I'll take 1 million. Out of the billion, I'll take 1 million. But the truth is, as you know, as a leader, like God stirs something in your heart, but maybe you're not quite ready to say it out loud, right? And you're like, that's a big thing. The moment I say it out loud, I'm going to be accountable for it. So I held that inside of me for 2 or 3 years, talked to a couple of close friends about it. And then we were actually on a retreat with our elders from Suncrest. And one of them asked me, they said, well, Greg, what's the dream? What's the dream? I said, well, you want to know what the dream is? I'm not saying this out loud. Like I've told my wife and a good friend, but I think it's Suncrest 1 million people by our 40th anniversary.
Okay.
Yes. And, within 15 minutes, the elders were like, Greg, that's it. That's it. That's what our church should be focused on. It's clearly in your heart. We all resonate with that. Why wouldn't we name it that way. And so from that retreat on, we just crystallized that this is who we are. We're a church planting church with vision to impact 1 million people. I tell people all the time, it's a serious number. You can say 1 million or 1 billion and people will be like, whatever, roll your eyes back. So I just remind people, no, we're counting it. We call every new church we've started every 2 or 3 years. We ask them, what churches have you started? We ask those churches, what churches have you started? And, at this stage, we've been doing it for a while. So, we have churches that have started churches, that have started churches, that have started churches, that have started churches, 8 generations down.
Wow.
And, the word exponential, is used in church planting all the time, but it's what we're doing, right? You don't get to 1 million by starting 65 churches. You get to 1 million by starting 65 churches that collectively have multiplied over 1,000 churches. And we're on course. And I just told our leaders this, a few weeks ago, actually, not to make the vision sound too small, but we're on course to hit about 1.3 or 1.4 million by 2030.
So this just warms my heart. You know how excited I am about this. And it's all about multiplication. You can't do it by just adding people. You have to multiply. And that's what you're saying.
Yep.
And so, Greg, my hunch is you're just going to blow that number out of the water. And it's just such an exciting vision. Now, is this all U.S.? Is this global? We'll talk about that. What's going on with church planting? Yeah.
Great question. So we definitely at this stage see it as a portfolio of church planting.
Yeah.
So it is U.S., it is international, it is a range of socioeconomic situations. So there are some church plants where we are a 6-figure investor, right? And there are some church plants where we can, genuinely, it's almost like we can buy someone a motorcycle and we plant 3 churches.
Absolutely. I know. Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah.
But we do it all. And I have a lot of conviction around this because, some people might say, oh, go try to reach the hardest places. You have resources now to do that. I'm like, I want to do that. Some people say, oh, well, if you can plant a church with a motorbike, why not just keep doing that? And I just remind people, Suncrest is a suburban church plant. People put resources into us when we planted it. I think at that stage, it cost $200,000, $300,000 of outside support to plant the church. And, these days, of course, we've given millions and millions of dollars away. And I think we have to do all of that. If we only plant churches in India, in those smaller settings, or Liberia, Africa, kind of 2 major places for us, those churches aren't going to resource the next generation of churches.
Correct. Right.
The way a suburban church plant might. But we have to do it all. So I think portfolio.
Okay. I love the portfolio idea. And so, Greg, let's talk a little bit about, because you are talking about different price points. And I think about all of our church planters listening now, or let's say you're a pastor of, the average size church in the United States that has 70 to 100 people in it. And I just keep thinking to myself, if we can just mobilize that group of churches to plant a church. But I think, I remember back when we were launching and we're thinking, how we don't have $87,000 to plant a church in South America, or we don't have $50,000 to help plant a church in San Francisco. But there are different price points. Speak to that a little bit about how maybe younger churches or smaller churches could get involved in multiplication.
Yeah. So I have 2 major ways I think about that. One is that it is okay, like if you're committing 10% of your budget or something like that, it's okay to store that up over a year or 2 or 3 years so that you can make a larger impact, right? But no one should think, unless I have $50,000, I can't really help. That is not the story. So one of my favorite things to do, because I want to multiply new churches, is to say, oh, here's a project out here. We did this with Stadia, actually, in Myanmar.
Yes.
There was a project that cost, I think it was around $30,000. Yes. And we said to one of our new churches, Good News Church in Ohio, Stadia church plant, we want to help them get in the church planting game, right? So we say to them, hey, we'll do $28,000. You do $2,000, and together Suncrest and Good News are going to plant this church.
Wow.
In this area. So I encourage to think like that. Obviously Suncrest is coming alongside in a major way, which, by the way, we would do with churches that are listening to this podcast. If it helps you get in the game, let's do this together.
Yeah.
Right. because what's going to happen is at Good News Church, they're going to, cast this vision for church planting. They're going to tell the story of a new church that gets started. Their people are going to be excited about it. And we want to help people get in the game, even if your investment is, hundreds or a few thousand rather than tens of thousands.
I love that you come alongside churches and invest in that way. I tell the planters and smaller churches all the time. I said, if you want to partner with Stadia, we can plant churches. I was just in the fall for a few weeks and I got to attend a graduation class of 60 church planters going out to plant. You know what it costs to plant a church in the fall?
Yes.
It's about $350 per church, Greg. And I'm like, any church can afford that, right? You move into India where, you're looking at like a $6,000 price point. And lots of churches can do $6,000. And then you can partner to plant a church in the US or in other more expensive areas to become a resource church. So I love that you're doing that. Great. Let me come back now. This value of children, because, State is committed to making sure every child has a church to help start thriving, growing, multiplying churches for the next generation. And I know you personally, your family, you're very committed to that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I always feel like when I talk about this, that I should give credit where it's due, which is my wife, right?
I always.
But yeah, about 5 years ago, my wife came home and said, "Hey, honey, have you ever thought about, adopting 3 little girls?" And I said, "No, actually, I have. Not once." She said, "Well, I think God's leading us to that." And it's a long story. We did not end up with the 3 little girls that God originally placed on our heart, but it did get us close to the system and saw the need for children to have homes. And Greg, this intersects with church planting a lot for me, because I do think one of the mistakes church planting churches make is we cast a vision for church planting, but we actually cast a vision for starting worship services. Right. So like Suncrest, when I cast the vision for church planting, if they only think we're starting worship services somewhere, that's not that inspiring to them.
Right.
But just as Suncrest and individuals at Suncrest are involved in changing the world and being called to being foster parents like we have and others, that's what we're doing. We're starting churches that make a kingdom impact where they are, where they're changing the world where they are with children. Right. So God placed that on our heart. And, we ended up having a teenager we fostered. We adopted him, as our son. He's now in the United States Marines, very proud of him. And then another long story, but we were fostering another teenager who had a little baby. Unfortunately, it didn't work out with the teenager, but we were left with the baby. He's now 3 years old. Our adoption of him should be official next month. And God has just done, amazing things in our hearts through that.
And you have 2 biological children as well. So, and you're leading, a large church, multiplication, reaching 1 million people. How do you have the energy, in all seriousness? Because a lot of leaders are out there and they're going, man, that sounds really good. But, how do I have the time to do that and fit? Can you speak to, what would you say to them?
I don't know. Maybe I'm unique in this way, but I've never felt like I had enough time to do anything, which means that can't be the barrier, whatever that is. We kind of figure it out. Certainly you have to have margin at certain points in your life. I know you and I kind of share this rhythm in the summer of stepping back and taking a break to reset for what's next. I'm a big believer in Sabbath rhythm.
Agreed.
And things like that. But, on the whole, I think one of the things we're constantly one of the things an American pastor has to push against and model against is the consumer culture, right? That there's an orientation to life, that it is about me and it's about my comfort. And it's about, like the dream is somehow to retire, and golf and fish and do nothing of consequence. Listen, I love golfing, right? I love that stuff, but we have to just keep going all in every chance we get, when God leads us to something. So it's not a strategy as much as it is a conviction.
Yeah,
say yes.
I appreciate that, Greg. When my wife and I have been down the same journey, you're on foster adoption, and man, it's just been one of the biggest blessings in our life and in how it's transformed us and in so many ways. And we came to the realization at one point, somebody was talking about your empty nest years. And we said, you know what? If we have empty nest years, they're going to be really short. And just have, you go, well, are you convicted about this? Is it a priority that, every child matters, every person matters, and the next generation is the future of the church today. So, it's really about those priorities. So you stayed at Suncrest 25 years, man, and we have lots of church leaders and planners listening. Talk about staying somewhere for 20. I know you've had offers. I know, you've had thoughts, but talk about some of the advantages and how you've stayed 25 years.
Yeah. You know, I don't say this flippantly. It is God's goodness to me. I could rewind this all the way back to when I was a teenager and feeling this call to ministry. I grew up in a small church in a rural area, and the ministers moved, it seemed like every 3 or 5 years. And the biggest hesitation I had about going into ministry was like, oh, it means I'm going to have to move my family all the time. That was my picture of it. Right. And I had a few mentors in my life say, no, there's a different picture. You can do it a different way. And so, my wife and I just had a lot of conviction that we're going to go somewhere and stay, and we're going to build something over time. In some ways, it's my personality, right? I'm not the flashiest. That's not me. I'm just a solid, steady. When I tell people the story of Suncrest growth, it's not that one year we grew 70%. That's never happened. It's just, 5%, 10%, 15% every year over time. That's how we're going to do church planting. We're going to put in a 20-year vision for church planting. We're going to watch it and just keep working the system, working the plan to prioritize it. So, I think I'm a good fit for where we are. I know this is a public podcast. I have had offers to go other places. I usually just dismiss them immediately, right? Just like it's not, and even the one time I was serious about pursuing something, in the end, this is honestly, maybe this is helpful for staying a long time. In the end, my sense was, well, I could go somewhere, that's much bigger than we are now with a bigger budget and resources, where I could just do all the things I start to dream about in that place here.
Wow.
Because I, at that stage, had, 15 years of credibility here, and of course, integrity matters. You don't stay one place if you can't, love people well and be selfless and, stay on the rails with your personal morality, all those things. But man, the benefits are so strong. And Greg, one of the things I always want to tell, maybe your church planners, but especially pastors of churches watching this, is I think sometimes the perception about being a church planting church might be that like, oh, people are going to think we're giving our resources away. Like maybe it's not good. One of the benefits of staying somewhere 25 years is you make relationships that become major donors in your church, right? That people who trust you over time. And I know the generosity of our church has increased because we cast the vision for impacting 1 million people, right? And I don't think you can show up in your first year, cast that vision, and have people resource that. Yeah. I think you have to stay a little while, build that credibility. But then they also have a vision that's so far beyond just, reaching thousands here. It's like, wow, what if you could be a part of reaching 1 million?
So, Greg, I wholeheartedly agree to that. I was at River Tree for 25 years as the senior pastor before moving to Stadia. Yeah. Never thought I'd leave River Tree, but God really did call me to Stadia. But I got to tell you a story that just happened just in the last couple of weeks. I had a family email me and say, hey, we were at River Tree 15 years ago, and we loved the vision of multiplication, and we were heavily involved in church planting like you were. And we came up to you after a service one day, Greg, and we said, one day we're going to plant a church ourselves. And so they were emailing me. And so I get on a Zoom call with them, and I remember them once I'm on the Zoom call and I see them. And they just got an inheritance of $2 million and said they wanted to tithe. And so what would our $200,000 do in church planting? And so, I said, well, it would help Stadia start 8 churches, in the United States, or it could start, X number of churches in Nepal, or and it was so fun. But back to your original point, that was the fruit from 15 years ago. And that it took, so you never know those seeds that are being planted and developing people like that, what God's doing in their hearts. So I so appreciate what you're saying. So Greg, if people, let's just say as we kind of wrap up here, people, our leaders are out there, they're in church plants or in churches right now. If they want to get this kind of vision of multiplication started in the church and its ground level, give them just a couple, 1, 2, 3 things that you'd say, hey, here's the first couple steps you want to take.
Well, I don't think anything's more important than finding a quality project to partner on that is going to be an early win.
Yes.
Right. So, you can sit around in meetings and talk about it, and you should. They let people see your heart and how exponential really works. But finding that first partner and having a sense that, listen, church planters are my heroes, and there are no slam dunks, right? Like projects are hard and these are tests of faith. But if you could find a project early on that you think, yeah, this could go, and then you form a relationship with that church planter, right? So I just, I'm taking some time off this summer from preaching, right? Guess who our guest speakers are? It's all of our church planters, right? I bring them in, they're guest speakers.
Fantastic.
I want Suncrest to know them, to see them, right? To hear their story, to hear them say thank you to Suncrest, right? And yeah, I'm doing that with 4 people this summer, but you just have to have one. You have to have a project and a leader who resonates with your leadership, your church, and it really is a relationship. And I think if you get the first one in place, and then a few years later that church is starting a new church, and you get to tell that story again, that is ground level. Find that first project that's a win, and do what you can. Right? Major partner. Or almost everyone starts as a minor partner, and then you grow up to those major partners.
Greg Lee, Suncrest Christian Church, 1 million people by 2034, which they're going to blow out of the water. Greg, I'm so grateful for you as a friend and as a partner. Thanks for being on the Church Planting Podcast.
Hey, I'm happy to do it. Love you, Greg, and love what Stadia is doing.